Well, folks, we're back with our final Audiopocalypse Mini-Set card review, and we're kicking it over the crazy card. I love cards like this so much. Fanatum, Lord of the Opera, a 30 mana card. 30 mana card, that's so sick. He's a 15/15 with taunt and lifesteal, and this card's cost is equal to the amount of cards in your deck. So we have another sort of fatigue slash card draw synergy piece here with Fanatum, which is so freaking cool. We've had a few of the fatigue package cards show up in this most recent Festival of Legends set, and we've also of course had various card burning cards in Warlock as well. We've had things like Rin First Disciple that is pulling cards out of decks, and now you're getting a payoff for burning through your deck so quickly with Fanatum, which is, you know, maybe a 0 mana 15/15 at some point. Probably more reasonably, you're going to start playing this as like a 5 mana 15/15, a 7 mana 15/15, which is pretty freaking cool. Now, of course, in some scenarios, that's going to completely lock out a lot of decks. If they are aggressive, board-based decks without any kind of removal, and they have to start trading into a 15/15 with lifesteal because it has taunt, that's going to end the game. That's just going to shut down board-based aggressive decks without any over-the-top damage. Of course, other decks are not going to have any problem killing this guy. He's a singular threat. You know, a one light it burns from Priest is basically going to kill your entire Fanatum Lord of the Opera, which is sad and disappointing. Sad that he will die so easily. So really the question is it going to be worth it to play for this really distinct game plan and create this? It's really basically kind of a race condition of sorts almost, where you're trying to burn through your deck really quickly and then dump this and maybe some of your fatigue rewarding cards as well, and just sort of overwhelm the opponent in these final couple pushes. Is that going to be worth it when some decks just kind of don't really care and stabilize anyway on the back of this? I mean, there's also this angle too where this is still a lot of work, but you burn through your deck really quickly, you drop stuff like this, and then you play Symphony of Sins, and you hope that Symphony of Sins refilling your deck after you've netted the 0 mana 15/15 is enough to kind of get you over the hump as well. I still have concerns that in a lot of matchups, it's just not going to be good enough. This guy's just not like immediately threatening enough. You know, he has to stick around to attack and create that pressure. So some matchups just won't absolutely care, which again makes me really, really sad. So, you know, this card is one of those where you're like creating this one turn or, you know, a couple turn window where it's like, this is my push. I'm hoping to win the game on this push. You know, is this enough? And I think it's going to come up short so often, both before you get to that window and then also sometimes even during the window it's going to fail, that this card is, unfortunately, it hurts me to say that. I think it's probably more of a meme, just way too hard to activate, and not even that great when it does, which I'm telling you that hurts me to my very soul and core because I love cards like this so much, but probably not actually all that good as far as I'm concerned, which, oh boy, that stings. But I do love this card. We're gonna play the crap out of this card. All right, so next up is the Fiddle Fire Imp, a 3 mana 3/2 demon with battle cry. Add a random Fire Mage and Fire Warlock spell to your hand. And if you look at those pools of cards right now, I mean, it's not like the worst. What's happening here? Website, be normal. You know, there's some decent mage spells here, some kind of expensive-y damage in particular. Fireball would be pretty decent. Warlock is definitely worse. Warlock doesn't have much to work with here. I think you'd be happy with Hellfire, and that's about it. So, you know, some okay cards if you're looking for a value generator. This has some imp synergies as well. Of course, we got plenty of imp packages. By the way, the artwork on this looks freaking awesome. I should acknowledge this card looks amazing. I do think it's kind of clunky to play though, both in Mage and in Warlock, which I didn't say. This is a dual class card, obviously. I don't know, man. Like, why do you need this one? Why do you need this much value for the sake of value? Why do you need this many fire spells? Are you happy to play a 3 mana 3/2? I don't think most decks need this. Mage has other ways to create lots of cool stuff that is more singular in its direction, making, you know, like little burst damage cards and stuff. Warlock has better imp lines, so I think this kind of falls in a gap. And then finally here for our dual class card, we've got Reverberations, a 3 mana Warlock mage spell. Shadow, and summon a copy of a minion. Each one dies, after taking damage. So a couple different ways to use this. Number one, you can use it on your own stuff to create copies of things you want to copy, maybe like a death rattle effect, for instance. In Mage, I'm thinking about the audio splitter guy who copies a big spell. You get an extra one of those, you get another big pyroblast in hand, then you play Millhouse, and there's some kind of crazy OTK setup. Seems kind of meme at best, seems pretty awkward and slow. And then you've also got the option to use this on your opponent's stuff as well, so you can actually use this on something big and scary your opponent plays, and then use a ping for Mage to kill it, because now it only takes a single damage to wipe it out, making sure you've got a setup. But that also kind of feels clunky to me, like a 2-card removal setup that requires kind of an AoE to kill the next one as well. So I don't know about using this defensively quite as much. There's kind of also an angle with Warlock with like more traditional death rattles, tempo death rattles, just playing some eggs or things you're happy to die. And the fact that they're dying after taking a single damage is no big deal if you've got death rattles where you want stuff to die anyway. And you can do that, but then this is kind of weird on that because it's 3 mana. You're playing for board and tempo in those instances. That feels kind of clunky too. And then big death rattles later, possibilities are there too, but also just doesn't necessarily feel like the reward here is worth it in many cases for me. So it's a card that does do a lot of different little things, but I don't know if it does any of them in such a specific and powerful direction that anyone really needs to run this card. I'm not sure what this is actually setting up or enabling, that just playing something else instead might not just do better. So just not that interesting or exciting as far as I'm concerned. So moving on over to Priest and Druid dual class, kicking it off with Fanboy, a new 2-mana 2/2. Choose one, give a friendly minion +2 attack and rush, or +2 health and lifesteal. So I think a few different ways you might envision this card getting played. Number one is just like on curve as a tempo play. You play a 1/3, you drop Fanboy on turn 2, you get a nice attack buff, even if you don't care about the rush. Maybe you're just happy to like start sending your 3/3 to face and develop a 2/2 alongside it in some kind of, tokeny style druid deck as a way to get some additional damage. You could also do this very same thing, but prioritize health instead if you care a lot about the survivability of minions, maybe sticking into future buffs. We're going to see some overheal stuff in Priest in this review, and we've already seen some as well before, that is definitely going to rely on multiple minions sticking on board in order to proc some great overheal payoffs and synergies. So using a card like this just to shore up health totals early and make sure enough minions are kind of lingering around into the mid game might have some really significant upsides as well. So just buff something's health, take a trade, leave it there to be healed. Maybe you don't take a trade, maybe just happily overheal it at full health, but it survives is the important thing, and that could be a nice play. And then finally, the fact that this can give stuff lifesteal is also really interesting. There are some plays like a Wild Pyromancer, for instance. If you give a Wild Pyromancer lifesteal, you could use it to potentially just wipe out an opponent's board while also healing yourself for like 1 billion health, turning it into kind of a Reno sort of play. Priest can keep healing the Wild Pyromancer to keep it alive or buff it and so on. So some intriguing options there for giving things lifesteal. Oh, and then also just rush sometimes to pull yourself back on board. Play this alongside whatever tiny minion, give it rush and attack, trade up, you might be happy to swing the board back a little bit. So I think an interesting card from both kind of a tempo standpoint, but also an interesting card for these setups with Wild Pyros or whatever other big card has a reason to love lifesteal with some kind of AoE effect, whatever it might be. The Fanboy here can be healing in a pinch and tempo as well. So gives it a couple different directions, I think, across both classes. I think this card has some pretty intriguing utility because of that. So moving on here to Funnel Cake. This is a card that got like kind of leaked super early, but finally getting it officially revealed. It's also dual class Priest Druid, 1 mana spell, and this is what I was talking about for having minions alive on board being really important for these kinds of cards. This one's going to restore 3 health to a minion and its neighbors, and then for each one that's overhealed, you're going to refresh a mana crystal. So this can hit 3 targets, right, with 3 health. A minion and its neighbors is 3 targets, which means when you play this, you might refresh up to 3 mana crystals. Of course, this costs 1 itself, so it's kind of like a net of 2 mana crystals pulled back here off the Funnel Cake. But importantly, you have to have those minions on board. So having stuff that's stuck around from previous turns because of health buffs could be a nice way to do that. Alternatively, of course, if you just are reloading, you got like a 4 or 5 mana turn or something, it might not be too hard to play 3 things, use the Funnel Cake to get a little bit of mana back, and then develop on top of those with additional minions, buffs, whatever it might be. So it's kind of in a pinch, you might be able to pull this off and just have a slightly extra higher mana turn than normal. or do something crazy with minions left behind and really start to push a lot. It is importantly refresh, not gain mana crystals, so you can't cheat things out early. It's more about playing more stuff in a given turn. But also importantly, just for overheal synergies in general, there are a lot of overheal cards and priests that just benefit from being healed. So this could both be the extra mana, but also additional ways to proc your other overheal synergies, giving you extra minions on board, extra buffs, and so on. So this kind of becomes both useful for that mana side of things, but also just the heal itself could be really, really valuable. So for priests in particular, I think this looks like a really spicy card. I could imagine these mid-game turns where you play a few overheal things, you use this to get a really big turn out of it, and at the end you've got some buffed minions, you've got 4 or 5 minions on board, and you're just kind of overwhelming the opponent with a lot of stuff thanks to the extra mana and the extra healing here off Funnel Cake. So this looks like a great engine for overheal. Now, overheal priest, you know, it's not gotten there yet. Overheal priest is not the way to play priest. We've seen undead priest as an archetype find more success. Is this finally the card that like hits the critical mass, that gives the priest the power it needs for overheal synergies to work? I think there's a chance it might be. This might be another one where, you know, overheal is a keyword we're expecting to stick around for a long time. So maybe, you know, a set or two down the line, we finally do hit that critical mass of overheal. So this may not be good quite yet, but this seems like it could be an absolute building block, fundamental piece for overheal priests moving forward. I think this card looks pretty dang strong. So then finally for priests, we have the Ambient Light Spawn, which, dude, this card looks awesome. This art is like really beautiful, dude. It's like a giant elemental guy with like crazy music going around him. I don't know, it's cool looking. Anyway, it's a 4-mana 3/4 elemental. It's got both Finale and Overheal. Give another random friendly minion +2/+2. So potentially some really big buffs here, right? If you just play this on turn 4, and again, you have something left behind like we talked about previously, this can be a great 2/2 buff on a minion that's already in play. Push that phase, take some great trades, etc. You're kind of developing 5, 6 in stats, but then you've also got this upside with Overheal for future turns or immediately if you've like pre-equipped the weapon that's making your hero power free, if you've got a location down, if you've got some mana to play your Funnel Cake, then suddenly the Ambient Light Spawn is developing you a crazy big board with potentially lots of buffs all at once. And that could be the absolute crazy mid-game kind of development, follow-up push that you need to really get over the hump against certain decks, because they just won't be able to answer this big old pile of stats this early in the game, which is cool. Now, that said, I do worry about the Ambient Light Spawn here, because if you don't have anything on board, this becomes a pretty expensive card to weave into a single turn with other plays. In other words, to have a minion down first, you need to be maybe 5, 6, 7 mana to really have something that you're excited about doing altogether. So this is perhaps very, very reliant on you not falling behind in the early game. This is not going to be a great recover card, and this style of priest so far, we haven't seen a lot of great recovery tools either, where once you fall behind, you can sort of flip things back in your favor. Maybe just making a big pile of stats will do it. I don't really think this is the card to do that, though, because it has such a high upfront cost at 4. So, you know, like if you need to restabilize on turn 5, the Ambient Light Spawn's probably not going to be a part of that equation. You just may not have enough mana to work with to make all of that happen. So you might need a lot cheaper plays to kind of redevelop. Maybe it won't be enough. So this does live in that weird space where it's really strong, I think, if you're ahead, and it can definitely help you seal a game, and some might call it a win more card in that regard. I don't think it's a win more card. I think it's just a win card. Like, this will help you seal the deal and leverage your early board into the end game push that you need to win, but it has just absolutely zero recovery, I'm afraid, which is a problem. Before, when we saw these kind of buff priests with like Naga Priest in the past, you had Boon of the Ascended, which could make you these like ginormous taunt minions. So you could go off on this big pop-off turn and then turn it into a giant taunt. And sometimes that would be enough to help you recover, because your opponent would have to interact through that giant taunt. Sometimes they just couldn't push through those stats, and that would be enough to win. Without this having taunt, or without setting up some crazy big stat pushes on a taunt like that, do you have the same recovery options? I don't know. That might mean that even if Overheal Priest looks really good, does this card actually serve the purpose in the deck? Is it just a little bit too clunky, too expensive, too conditional to actually be worth it? I got some questions there. So ultimately, really, really high potential when things are going well, and I'm afraid really bad when things are going poorly, which might just leave this in an okay spot at best. So moving on to Demon Hunter and Rogue here, we've got a new legendary Rhythm Dancer Orisa, a new 5-mana 3/5 with Rush, and it reads, after your hero attacks, return this to your hand and set its cost to 1. So when you've played this down and you've started to attacking, you could play this down, take a little value trade, kill off 3/3 or whatever, attack into something, maybe just hit face, and you've got a 1 mana 3/5 in hand that will presumably be a 1 mana 3/5 most turns moving forward if you're presuming to weave attacks through, which you probably would be if playing this. And of course, we know 1 mana 3/5s are really good, right? We saw with Knowles in Rogue over and over again, 0 mana 3/5s, 1 mana 3/5s with Rush. Those feel great to play. But importantly, those felt really great to play on turn 2 or whatever. You want to play them early in the game where they're really swinging tempo in your favor. They're killing your opponent's early game stuff. They're leaving behind threats on board. They're getting chip damage. They're really putting your opponent on the back foot. That's what made Knowles so great when they were discounted. A 1-cost Knoll on turn 6 or 7 or 8 is far less impactful than a 1-cost Knoll on turn 2 or 3. So I have some major concerns there about Rhythm Dancer Risa, and that's not even counting the fact that you have to spend 5 mana on her first. That is a huge penalty. To get this cool 1 mana thing later, I have to spend 5 mana on a 3/5 rush minion. I think that is just way too much upfront cost. I don't think any Demon Hunter or Rogue is going to want to spend 5 mana on this card, because to sort of reap the benefit of it, it's going to take 3 or 4 more turns after that where you're playing this multiple times. And even then, it's not even that exciting. It's kind of like a 1 mana deal 3 to a minion, which is like, man, because presumably you're not leaving the threat behind on board. So to me, this just looks super clunky to use, comes down far too late for what these decks are trying to do. None of these classes are going to want to spend 5 mana up front on this sort of effect. There are obviously some Rush synergies in Demon Hunter, specifically with like Halveria and the Rush package, but there's going to be way cheaper ways to play Rush and activate Rush consistently for Halveria. You're not even looking to do that multiple turns in a row. You kind of want that one big push probably with Halveria, so the repeating nature of this seems irrelevant as well. Basically, I hate to say it because I want legendaries to be good, but I think this is a stinker. I do not think this card's going to be very good. Just feels like too much work, too much condition, too much expense, and the payoff isn't even that good. So sorry, Rhythm Dancer Risa, I don't think you're going to see much play. Tough Crowd is a new 3-drop for Rogue and Demon Hunter, again, dual class. It's a 2/1 demon with Outcast. Return a minion to its owner's hand. So this can be 2 things. This can be a bounce effect, as you might see in Rogue. Well, also it's going to be a sap effect, which you see in Rogue as well. Both of these are sort of Rogue effects. The Outcast and Demon part is the Demon Hunter side of things. But pretty expensive for a bounce effect, of course. 3 mana to bounce a single card. That's really pricey. That's not even going to compare at all to things, like Breakdance or Shadow Step. Way better as a bounce effect. Now, as a sap effect, I mean, we like sap effects in Hearthstone. Those can be really nice, pushing stuff back into your opponent's hand. I do think sap effects have gotten worse and worse over time in Hearthstone because people are less about investing into kind of one big thing. They're going wider on board. They're playing cheap things. So bouncing things back to hand isn't quite as disruptive as it perhaps used to be. So I don't even think sap is as good as it used to be in the past. But on top of that, this is a 3 mana sap that also has to be outcasted, which don't sleep on that. When you're having outcast effects, you don't want them to be things where it's like it has to happen for it to be good. You want them to have a strong base effect, and then the outcast is kind of a bonus sometimes, or you want them to be cheap enough that it's kind of easy to work through your hand to get them into an outcast position more easily. This is neither of those things. This is really expensive. That's going to clog up hands and be awkward to play. It's time restricted, so you have to wait for the right moment to use this, which is bad. Sometimes for outcast sorts of plays, you can't just cycle through your hand. I was gonna say something else. It's expensive. It's whatever. You get the idea. It's not good with Outcast. Now, on top of that, this actually just existing in the Outcast pool is gonna be bad for Outcast Demon Hunter because they're not gonna want to roll into this very often in their Outcast plays. They want cheap Outcast plays that help them cycle through multiple Outcast plays. This is actually really expensive at 3 mana. This is gonna eat through turns and probably not even be all that good. Sometimes you might even have to bounce your own minions if you're head on board when you don't want to. So this card just existing is actually a huge problem for Outcast Demon Hunter. I don't actually think it's that good. Is it like a main deck? I don't think people are going to find an excuse to run this one these days. So ultimately, Tough Crowd looks like a pretty tough card as far as I'm concerned. I don't think this gets there anymore. I know Sap used to be such an awesome thing, but that Outcast is so restrictive on this one that I don't think it gets there. And then finally for Demon Hunter, we have the Remixed Rhapsody, a 5-mana spell. Deals 3 damage to all minions as a base, so a bit of a board clear here. And then also, of course, as all remix cards do, gains an extra effect in hand. And all these effects look pretty good, actually. The Angsty Rhapsody is going to draw you 3 cards. So deal 3 to the board and draw 3. That's insane when that hits. Emotional is going to give you +5 attack. That's probably not as exciting, but still not bad for Demon Hunter. Just pushing 5 for face is not going to feel too bad. Or maybe cleaning up a remaining big minion that didn't get killed by the 3 damage. Resounding is going to deal 3 damage twice, so that becomes a notably better board clear at deal 6. And then finally, Wailing is going to summon you a 5/5 demon after dealing 3 damage to all minions. So this is really the first case, I think, with the remixed cards where I feel like all the results are pretty good. There are still some I think you're going to value more in certain situations, like drawing 3 is going to feel great a lot of the time. I think sometimes you'll absolutely want it to be resounding to deal 6 because otherwise it's not good enough. But I don't think there's like total whiffs on this one. It has a little bit higher consistency than most. The question is always with these kinds of cards, deck fit. Who is running a 5-mana board clear in Demon Hunter? We have seen some big Demon Hunters that are playing a little bit slower. Those decks really want to spend their mid-game turns cheating out threats as opposed to like removing boards, but you could see a little bit of a shift in focus sometimes there, a little bit more control line for those decks somewhere in the next like year and a half when this card's going to be available in standard format. So there's a chance basically for this one. I don't think it's like crazy, but better than most of the remix cards we've seen so far, and I think has a little hope because of that in certain slower, more control-y Demon Hunter decks. Moving on to Druid and Warlock, we've got the Doomkin. This card is so freaking cool looking. I love Boomkins, but it's a Doomkin. That is so sick. It's a 6-mana 3/4 battle cry. Take one of your opponent's empty mana crystals. So keep in mind, this is actually doing 2 things. It's giving you an empty mana crystal, so you're ramping off of this, and it's also removing one from your opponent, so they're de-ramping. They're losing a little bit of mana access as well. So this is kind of a net 2-mana swing moving forward for you. And that's evil, number 1. Like, that's not going to be fun for the opponent. And kind of scary in Druid. You know, 6-mana card is very expensive in most decks. A little less problematic in Druid, perhaps, because Druid, of course, is already probably ramping up to this. It's going to feel more like their 4 or 5-mana turn in many cases, which might be worth it. Now, I have some real debates about whether this is better than like a Nourish or not. And I've read a lot of debates too, and there's kind of 2 sides of this argument. The most common argument I've heard, and this makes sense, but I want to also address why it maybe doesn't make as much sense. The most common argument I've heard is that this is better than ramping 2 for yourself. They both create a net 2 difference, but it's better than ramping 2 for yourself because you eventually cap out at a max mana total, and you want to maintain as much advantage over the opponent as long as possible before they start to catch up once you hit your max mana, because eventually once you get to 10 they start closing that gap, right? So this pushing you both down keeps you kind of farther away from the total, which that makes sense, right? You have an extra turn basically for them to start netting the difference back, which is kind of cool. But alternatively, this doesn't advance you in mana quite as quickly either. So sometimes it's not just about the difference, it's about the plays that become accessible because your mana total is higher. In other words, you know, maybe you want to get to 10 mana for some reason, specifically because you have some 10 mana play that you want to make, or 9 mana play, or whatever it is. And a card that ramps you 2 gets you to that 9 mana play faster. Even if your opponent catches up a little quicker, you're doing the big awesome thing sooner than you would with Doomkin. So not just the mana differential, but the mana accessibility at the top end as well is a concern. So some decks might value just straight ramp more with something like Nourish, not to mention Nourish is just cheaper because you're getting that 2 mana back immediately. It only costs 5 total. But then again, of course, there's other scenarios and other metas where limiting your opponent might be a really big deal because they're trying to get to a specific mana threshold. It's like, oh man, they have a crazy turn 8 play. I need to limit them from playing their turn 8 play. The Doomkin could basically slow them down, play a couple of these, and limit them so I have more time to get under their crazy gameplay. So it's kind of intriguing in that way. Now, that said, you know, this card I think is still like kind of a weird niche card. Not all Druids are going to care about this. Some are just going to want to push their game plan as quickly as they can. Others might value limiting the opponent a little more. I actually see a much harder time for this card getting played in Warlock, despite some of the disruption that exists in Warlock. It just feels like this is going to be really expensive to play in Warlock without the ramp to back it up. So I don't think this is going to be a card we see much in Warlock at all. I think it's going to have really limited uses in Druid. Probably will be fine here and there, but I don't think this becomes like a staple or anything. If it were 5 mana or 4 mana, it'd be crazy busted good, right? But 6 is, I think, probably a spot where they knew this wouldn't get played too much because they probably didn't want it to get played too much because it's kind of a frustrating and evil sort of effect. So moving on to the Blood Treant, a 5 mana 2/2 that costs health instead of mana, and this card's pretty intriguing. Now, I do want to note a change that was made for cards that cost health. This kind of flew under the radar, kind of a silent rules change, if you will. They no longer proc like damage based effects. So some of the like Warlock stuff, like the harp that when you take damage you heal instead, shouldn't actually work with the Blood Treant based on what we heard. I think this will actually still just cost you health. So you really are just kind of paying 5 health in this case for a 2/2. Now that kind of makes this a 0 mana 2/2, which means you can get aggressive and play this down really quickly and start to swarm and overwhelm people, particularly, you know, in like a token Druid deck. This might just be a way for helping you build the board really fast and then following that up with extra damage. I'm a little concerned that this is only a 2/2 in this case. We've had a few of these cards in the past that help you play like a 0 mana follow-up in aggro decks, and they've been more in that 3/3 range, 4/4 range to make them feel worth it. I think a 2/2 maybe just gets cleaned up a little too easily in various like early game board sweeps and stuff, and then maybe you've spent 5 health and not really done much extra. So I don't know if this is quite big enough or quite aggressive enough for that game plan. And then you start to worry like, man, this 5 health was actually a pretty big price to pay, even with healing and Warlock, even with armor gain and Druid. If you're playing this card, you're probably doing it in an aggressive deck without much of either of those. So you might just kind of fall over the opponent, pushing you back and racing you down without really developing much extra. So I think the Blood Treant's in a little bit of a clunky spot there. I think still possible in certain metas. This is like a 3-star card, basically, is what I'm pointing at, but not that like crazy 4-star hyper aggressive card we've seen from some of these in the past. And then finally here we have the popular Pixie, a 2 mana 2/3 with choose one, refresh your hero power, or your next one costs 0. So some more hero power synergy. Of course, we got the big armor gain, big attack gain stuff in Druid. For your next one costing 0, we've already seen that effect with Tour Guide, which I don't think Druids are really even running much Tour Guide right now, so I don't know that spending an extra mana to also get a cheaper hero power is worth it. There is some intrigue here with the refreshing your hero power, because that could help you just gain like a ton of attack and armor in a single turn. So you could basically pop off big time, get, you know, 6-8 attack or something on your hero power, a bunch of armor, use this to kind of cycle through multiples and then hit your opponent for a bunch. That probably feels like a less lethal sort of play than just playing big awesome stuff in Druid. I don't know that spending that much mana just to get hero powers is going to feel worth it when the deck can just do so many big scary things right now instead. But I do, you know, there's still some upside in like having that flexibility over something like Tour Guide. Maybe that gives us a little bit of a bump. So sometimes you can use it to set up like a big Zoc on the following turn, and then sometimes you can use it for lethality. Does the flexibility add an extra layer for this card? Maybe. I think it helps a little bit, but ultimately still probably not packing enough punch compared to the punch that deck wants to pack when it has so much spare mana to use and so many big things it can play. 2 mana cards with kind of marginally useful effects don't really stand out in decks like that as much because they can do so many big awesome things. So I just don't know that this keeps up quite as well in a deck that has so many other great options. Fanatum, Lord of the Opera, is a 2-star card. Fiddlefire Imp is a 2-star card. Reverberations is a 2-star card. Fanboy is a 4-star card. Funnel Cake is a 4-star card. Ambient Lightspawn is a 3-star card. Rhythm Dancer Risa is a 1-star card. Tough Crowd is a 2-star card. Remixed Rhapsody is a 3-star card. Doomkin is a 3-star card. Blood Treant is a 3-star card. Popular Pixie is a 2-star card. And there you go, folks. That wraps it up for the Audiopocalypse Mini-Set card reviews. We'll be playing some of these cards soon. Definitely going to be playing this one a ton. This card looks so freaking fun to me. And yeah, we'll try out all kinds of new decks in both standard and dual, so stay tuned. Thanks much as always for watching. Share your thoughts on these cards down below. And until next time, game on.